proceed. Okay, welcome to all of you to the fourth annual Paper Conservation Symposium in Technical Art History. We're so pleased that you can join us today and hope this will be a wonderful penultimate finale to Old Master Drawings Week or Master Drawings Week. For the past 4 years, my colleagues and I have been hosting this symposium focused on technical art history, covering topics that celebrate the diverse world of works on paper and the range of materials that are used for their execution. Last year, for those of you who weren't here, our speakers discussed decorated papers, examining 16th century Turkish marble paper and its origins. And in contrast, the other speaker focused on the immense variety of papers used for decorating walls, boxes, writing cards, and other utilitarian purposes that were made through the 19th century. The year prior to that, our symposium addressed the fabrication of traditional artist materials in the modern world. One speaker discussed her 200-year-old business that specializes in pastel. The other, a producer of a broad range of colors that he sources and refines, provided fascinating insights into the challenges of this declining industry in the face of modern technology. And 3 years ago, our program was on paper making, one speaker describing how he revived the techniques of the 15th century mill, and the other discussing techniques of modern production. Our program today continues in this tradition of contrasting East and West, the traditional and the modern. Today, it will be the traditional and the modern. Today, we are focused on the historic and contemporary practice of a particular type of drawing, known both as metal point and as silver point. The terms, the more generic metal point being preferred today, refer both to the type of drawing and to the material used to make it. Concisely, for those of you who do not know, it's the practice of mark making with soft metal. Silver, gold, and lead, among many others, are applied to specially prepared or coated paper, parchment, or wood panel with a special tool. Along with ink and chalk, metal point was one of the 3 main methods of producing drawings on paper before the modern era. The technique is believed to have emerged in classical antiquity, probably then used for architects or by architects, although no ancient examples survive, and used in medieval times for rulings and underdrawings in parchment manuscripts. Drawing with the silver stylus on a surface built up of many coats of burned bones, animal skin glue, white lead, saliva, or oils was first described by Cennino Cennini in about 1400. Greatly prized from the late Quattrocento through the Renaissance for its refinement and linearity, from the 16th century to the present, it has undergone periods of popularity, decline, and renewal, with infusions of fresh ideas along this period of time. Today, it is a thriving medium exploited by artists for the exceptional craftsmanship it demands and its beauty. Metal point has been used for spontaneous preparatory sketches and highly finished compositions, as it lends itself to great diversity, as seen in the work of Leonardo and many artists thereafter. There are many distinctive features about drawings in this medium that our speakers will address. Among them are its capacity for enormous precision, as well as broad tonal passages. The subtle differences in the luster of the various metals that have been used for this medium, the alteration in hue that metals undergo as they tarnish, the media with which it is combined, the diverse colors and textural qualities of the paper or parchment to which it's applied, and not to be ignored, its challenging handling properties, such as the lack of flexibility of the stylus, its limited textural substance, and the great difficulty in making changes and corrections. Our 2 speakers today will discuss the depth and breadth of this medium. I'll introduce Alan Donnithorne first, who will discuss traditional metal point drawing through the lens of Leonardo, one of its greatest practitioners in the Renaissance, and then Susan Schwalb, who is one of the foremost metal point artists of today, and she will talk about her work and her innovative techniques. Following the presentation, we will have a question and answer session, and then there will be a reception in the hall outside of this room. Alan Donnithorne's background is impressive. He started his career in paper conservation at the British Museum in 1976 and treated numerous drawings in that exceptional collection, eventually becoming head of the Western Pictorial Art Conservation Studio, or section. In 1994, he moved to the Royal Collection at Windsor Castle, where he worked as head of paper conservation for 22 years. His experience there included treatment of the extraordinary range of material: prints, drawings, Western and Indian watercolors, pastels, fans, photographs, papyrus, and Mexican codices. He has lectured frequently on diverse subjects, including historic mounts, and published articles on various topics, including 2 papers on the drawing materials of Leonardo da Vinci. After retiring in 2016, he researched and wrote Leonardo da Vinci, A Closer Look, a study of Leonardo's drawing materials and techniques, based on his remarkable research of the collection at Windsor. And this was published in 2019, and it is for sale available in our bookshop. In addition to the insights he provides on Leonardo's technique that are enhanced with extraordinary photographs that he has taken, his study teaches the reader how to both look at drawings and to understand Leonardo's process and materials as he reveals it through his photographs and sophisticated non-destructive analysis, such as infrared and false color imaging. So let us welcome Alan.
Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you all today. So I'm going to talk about Leonardo da Vinci's metal point drawings, and based on my knowledge of the Royal Collection housed at Windsor Castle in England. It's not to say I haven't looked at metal point drawings by Leonardo in other collections, but I don't have the insight into them that I do in the collection at Windsor. And I'm going to start by giving you an overview of those drawings. Now, there are nearly 600 drawings in the Royal Collection by Leonardo and his followers, and about 10% of those are done in the technique of metal point. That is, both lead point and silver point, and maybe other materials as well. And this represents the range. As you can see, there are diverse subjects, there are diverse coloured grounds, and diverse sizes as well. And these aren't actually entirely to scale, but it gives you an idea, more or less. Most of the drawings are quite small, about that size, I suppose. Many of them are quite small. So I'll be talking about some, but not all of these, because there isn't time, in effect, and nor did many of them need the kind of depth of study that others did. So let's start off by saying what we mean by metal point drawing. Marjorie's already, in a sense, done that for me, so I'll skip through this. It's really any drawing made using a metal stylus, and it can be a stylus, incidentally, that doesn't make a pigmented mark, but just an indentation in the paper, because Leonardo used that technique as well. But here, I'm mainly going to be talking about lead point and silver point. And these are some examples. The one at the top is a Victorian lead point, the sort of thing that you might have got with a sophisticated geometry set that I picked up at an antiques fair. The silver point stylus on the right is one I made myself just from a piece of sterling silver of square cross-section. Relatively easy thing to do. But the reason I made it, I'll come on to in a minute. But I should say, yes, when we talk about lead point, what we're really talking about is a mixture of lead and tin, and usually in the proportions of 2 parts lead to 1 part tin. And it will write on plain paper, whereas silver point will only write on paper which has been prepared with a ground that is at least mildly abrasive. And of course, there are other metals, as has already been mentioned, and we'll see some examples of that later on. There are some historical examples of people using metal point drawings. This is a painting by Jan Gossart, otherwise known as Mabius, and it shows St. Luke which St. Luke traditionally was known as an artist and reputedly drew or painted a portrait of the Virgin Mary, being directed by an angel to do so. And he's often, or at least sometimes, shown using a metal point of some sort. And the one that you see in the detail is a silver point made of a twisted wire, like the one I just showed earlier. And this is how the apprentice possibly could have worked. This is a drawing that happens to be in the Royal Collection by an artist of the circle of Benozzo Gozzoli, and shows an artist possibly using a stylus. It's not totally clear. I'm sorry, press the wrong button there. There is quite a straight, thin thing that he's holding there, but it's not possible to see exactly what he's holding. So apart from maybe feeding the dog and spending a lot of time grinding pigment, this is the kind of thing that the artist would do. And Leonardo, as a young artist, would probably be set to doing metal point drawings. Giannini, who's already been mentioned, recommended testing the use of metal point by covering a boxwood panel or a boxwood tablet with burnt bone mixed with saliva, and then using the silver point on that. And then you could easily erase it with a wet rag and then start again. This, of course, saved the master a lot of money on students not wasting very valuable paper. So, but anyway, this student seems to be using paper here. So there are one or two comments by Leonardo on the use of metal point. And he says to be sure to take with you a little book with pages prepared with bone meal and a silver point, briefly note the movements and actions of bystanders and their groupings. And this is the kind of drawing that might have been done by that. This drawing is quite small. It probably measures about that much. So it could well have come from some kind of sketchbook or something like that. So he's well aware of the use of the technique. Giannini talks at some length on the use of metal points of various sorts. He describes how to make lead point by hammering tin and lead together. And he talks about the use of silver point in various contexts and describes how to make grounds of different colors using this calcined bone. Calcined bone simply means but bone that's been burnt in a fire so well that it's virtually turned to ash. In other words, all the organic material has been driven off by the heat of the fire. And then the grounds will be made by grinding the bone meal with a pigment on a porphyry stone, something like this, with a muller, and mixed with rabbit skin glue usually, or animal glue of some sort as a binder, and then spread onto paper. And we can see when we analyze or look under reasonably high microscope, high magnification microscope, you can readily see bone fragments. In Leonardo's case, they tend to be quite coarsely ground. I think he didn't like wasting too much time grinding. Giannini says to grind, as long as you can, because the more you grind, the better it is. But I don't think Leonardo cared for that. I think he was more interested in the results. But that's just my opinion. The grounds on Leonardo's drawings generally quite coarse, so that the pigments are not very finely ground. And there are a whole variety which I've listed there, which we've identified almost on this rather brown ground on the right-hand side. You can see it's mostly red lead and white with some bits of charcoal and the odd particle of ultramarine. So it's and very thinly applied as well. You can see the paper fibers quite readily. When we came to analyze the drawings about 8 or 9 years ago, we looked at several as test examples to try and make sure we could identify the materials. And the technique used was Raman spectroscopy. It's not something we had in-house, so we had to bring in a technician with the equipment to do it. And some of the work was also done by scientists at the British Museum, which is the case for this drawing. And what you can see here is the top trace is of a white particle from the drawing, and the bottom trace is a reference particle from the database. And you can see a very noticeable spike in the spectra, which corresponds to the presence of bone white, which is essentially calcium phosphate. Raman spectroscopy is a technique by which you can analyze chemical compounds, so it's very useful for identifying these sorts of materials in drawings or indeed anything else. And here's another, looking at other pigments on the same one. There are two different red particles, one a sort of orange red and one a more sort of earthy color, and reference spectra for red lead and for hematite, iron oxide red, match these very closely. So that's a fairly easy thing to identify. And in this case, we have also looked at a blue particle and a black particle and identified indigo as the blue colorant and carbon black, in this case probably charcoal, as the black colorant that gives the blue paper, the blue coating, a slightly greyish look. Looking at the same drawing in transmitted light, we can see that the ground is brushed on in quite broad strokes, and although this is only a kind of narrow fragment of it, obviously it's cut from a much larger sheet that was brushed in this way. Most of the coatings of Leonardo's papers appear to have been done in a single layer. Giannini recommends doing a layer, letting it dry, and then going over it the other way, and so you build up a quite a dense coating. Leonardo, on the other hand, seemed to use quite thin coatings and didn't spend a lot of time getting them perfect. Again, I think it's because he wanted results. He wasn't so interested in the process. I've had a go myself using various examples of the colorants, and in this case on a ground glass slab with a glass muller. And it's interesting to see how even unconsciously you can end up with results that mimic the original Leonardo coatings. In this case, this is the same horse divided by lines, looking at it in raking light. And you notice these pits or craters in the surface, which are quite clearly the results of the ground having been applied quite quickly. And remember, you're using rabbit skin glue, so you actually have to warm it up and you have to apply the ground before it congeals again. So you really do have to work quite quickly, and depending on the kind of brush you use, you can get all kinds of different surface effects. In this case, the surface is fairly smooth, so it's probably a fairly soft brush, but nevertheless you get all these air bubbles, and I found in my without any deliberate intent at all, I found myself getting exactly the same effect because of the way that you had to work. Quite a nice bit of serendipity, really. I had also played with looking at different metals on paper, and I won't dwell on this, but it's noticeable if you look at the two examples of lead point on here, how in the areas between my stripes of ground, it actually is writing on the paper as well in each of these gaps, whereas none of the other materials, sorry, I should have put that up as well, seem to do that. So that just underlines that point that was made earlier. Here again, there's two sheets which appear to be almost entirely blank, and it's a wonder when you look at them at first as to why they were preserved amongst Leonardo's effects when he died. But it's interesting to see that both these sheets originally must have come from the same sheet, because the strokes of the application of the ground match exactly. We'll look at this again in a minute, this particular drawing. And again, you can, by looking at some of the examples, he only produced a few using red lead as a ground, but by sort of playing around with transmitted light images, you can kind of work out that they might well have come from the same sheet of paper and just been cut up. So the red lead phase may have just been one or two examples of preparation. There aren't that many of them around. Anyway, there are these three in the Royal Collection. And this is a drawing which, from quite an early period, which has a very thin coating of ground, particularly thin, on a very highly textured paper. And in transmitted light, you can see that the laid lines, first of all, the chain lines are very wide apart compared to most later papers. And the laid lines are very thick and very distant from each other. And the horn watermark here, which this is only partial, there should be a piece coming up from there, sort of like a triangle, matches fairly closely an example in the publication by Briquet on watermarks, which is dated to the 1300s. And the paper has the appearance of a very early paper. So Leonardo must have got hold of some paper that was probably well over 100 years old when he used it. It's quite an odd thing to have discovered. Looking at lead point drawings. Now, most of Leonardo's lead point drawings, he used lead point in the early part of his career. Most of them being obscured by later editions of pen and ink, not because the lead had faded or anything like that, but because presumably Leonardo, having done the sort of the preliminary drawing in lead, wanted to finalize to make his final choice of lines more definite. So he used ink on top of it. The infrared reflectance image on the right shows up the lead only because the iron gall ink becomes transparent in the infrared. So we're able to study these drawings very readily by looking at infrared reflectance. And this drawing in particular was done on a coated paper, which seemed unnecessary. Cennini says you can use lead on either coated or uncoated paper. So in this case, it happens to be a coated paper, the ground of which is entirely consistent with Leonardo's other drawings on which he uses materials other than lead. And he later revisited this drawing later in his career and put in measurements and things in ink. In high magnification, you can see several things. First of all, you can see the ink line, which is fairly obvious. You can see the metal point particles. Lead has this very characteristic, very shiny appearance and broken up, but also this very indistinct area here is charcoal. So it's clear that Leonardo used charcoal as the first stage of the drawing and then went over that with the lead point, and then finally, at a later date, went over it with ink. Another example where he's done the same sort of thing, but in this case, the lead point looks very kind of scratchy and indistinct. And in particular, the motif up the top here, which is another dragon, looks as though it's been partially erased. And Cennini, of course, recommends using bread as the method of erasure. And this type of erasure was used well up until the 18th century, until the advent of rubber from the Far East made it possible to use erasers made of other materials. I've tried it. It's quite possible, but you do leave traces behind. It's not that easy to remove all the particles of lead from a soft paper like this. Looking at it to higher magnification, you've got the head of this dragon, and by digital manipulation, subtracting an image taken with balanced light away from an image taken in raking light, you get the indentations only. And so you can see here not only the indentations from the stylus, but also quite a lot of disruption from some of the lines. Can you see this sort of ragged fibers here and up here, which may be evidence of some kind of erasure? I don't know. This drawing is a good illustration of Leonardo's habit, possibly, of using two different types of stylus on the same drawing. This is a drawing essentially, I think, in silver point. It hasn't actually been analysed, but it has all the appearance of a silver point drawing. But when we look at it in detail, we see that on the left, looking carefully in the eye there, can you see a sort of greyish material, which is different from the slightly brown, tarnished silver part of the image? And in infrared, we see that that same area has a very dense appearance, and also there are very dense lines around the outline of the face. And when we enlarge that, we see that, in fact, there's a great difference between the appearance of that grey material and the silver, and this again is lead point. There are other examples. Oh, sorry, first of all, just because this is a good example of Leonardo's use of the corners of the paper to just test out his stylus to make sure it's sort of behaving properly, to see how he likes it. That's interesting too, because otherwise this drawing has quite the appearance of a finished drawing, as if it were intended to be conceived as a finished drawing. But clearly, if he's doing test bits around the edges, it makes it less likely that that's the case. Here's another example of the use of two different styluses on the same drawing, a study of the neck and the skull, etc. You can see that parts of the image are quite faded here. There's sort of indentations and things that aren't very readily perceivable. But when we look at that in infrared, which again removes the ink, the silver point, if it is silver point, has disappeared, and all that is left is the lead point of the neck and the little drawing on the left. There's also, curiously, because this was taken over a black background, we can also see the watermark in the paper, which is something I've not yet been able to identify. It looks a bit like a football with wings, but I'm not quite sure. It's on its side. And this is another curious example where it's quite possible that here a different hand has taken up the lead point, because these marks here appear to be right-handed marks, although these are so cursive. They could have been done like this, with the hand or elbow at different angles. It's perfectly possible. So it's not easy to say categorically that they are by another hand. They might have been by Leonardo. And then we come to this drawing, which has been analysed and is a silver point. And we can see that if we show it at an angle with the light glancing off it into your eyes, it really does produce this wonderful mirror-like effect. It's quite astonishing to see in real life, or indeed even in a slide. And this drawing I've chosen because it illustrates his hand, the way he is using the point on the surface of the ground. If we look at one area here and enlarge it, we can see this sort of frantic scrabbling for the line or getting some kind of representation down, using fine points and using the edge of the point. And really, it's just, it's clearly a mind working very, very fast to get something down on paper. If we enlarge that even more, we can then perceive the surface of the paper and the texture, the slight shininess. Leonardo didn't incidentally burnish his grounds normally. They're normally fairly matte surface. You can also see here a number of the black particles which appear to be charcoal, again used to make the blue slightly greyer. Another part of the same drawing, and what you have here is a mixture of disciplined hatching and, again, frantic you can really sort of feel the speed of these cursive lines. And interestingly, notice that there are quite thin lines here and here and down here, for example, here. And then later on, he obviously went over it again with much thicker lines, all these ones here. So did he have a double-ended stylus like the one I showed earlier, with a fine point and a broad point? Was he simply using the edge of the stylus? Here you can see there's a very pronounced kind of cliff edge along the edge of the stroke here, which implies he's holding the stylus at a very low angle to the surface to get that broader effect. and not dissimilar from pen lines in many ways. This is a drawing which unfortunately had been folded in half and got damaged, so some of the ground has come off. And it's an example of using a stylus over the top of a silver point line. The back shows it's just been rubbed over with red chalk in order to effect a transfer. This was slightly dismissed at one time as if it had been gone over by a second hand, but actually when you look closer, I don't think that is the case. It is quite crudely done, very heavy-handed, because you can see fractures here where the stylus has actually cut through the paper. If we look closely at the surface, you can see there is an original faded silver point, somewhat faded silver point line or metal point line, and then over the top of that, other lines. And the darkness of these lines is simply to do with the burnishing caused by a steel point going over the surface. But notice that the new line is a pentimento. It's a change of mind from the earlier line, and it's unlikely that some student slavishly trying to trace the master's work would have done that. So it's my contention that it actually is by the artist. Oh, just looking at the area here, just out of interest really, at the close-up of the surface, again we see evidence of bone here, and you see the kind of pits from air bubbles bursting while the surface was congealing. But what I wanted to show really was the degree of craquelure in the surface, showing that really the surface of these drawings is really quite fragile, and it's something very much that conservators need to note when they're handling them and treating them, or indeed anyone else for that matter. Many of them have this kind of appearance under high magnification. This example of drawing of a bear's foot we looked at using multispectral analysis at the University College London, and it's quite a complex drawing because it was executed first in metal point and then gone over with iron gall ink and then also with a white lead body color highlight. And so the metal point is obscured in most cases, but using multispectral analysis, one can combine different images taken at different wavelengths of light and assign colors to those and do an algorithm which calculates differences between them. And you come up with a kind of color coding for all the different materials. It's highlighting the principal components of the image. And in this case, it shows it up quite well. Now coming to talk about, I mentioned earlier on the horse one, that there was some faded metal point. And this was first noted in 1935 and then later published in the 1950s. So it's nothing new. When Clark was cataloguing the Royal Collection, he found that some of the drawings were very indistinct and he couldn't really make out the subject matter, and so he couldn't say much about them in the catalogue. But later in 1977, when the catalogue was being revised with the assistance of Carlo Pedretti, they had got images which showed those apparently faded lines following various photography campaigns. And then we looked at them again in 2011 at the time of the exhibition in the National Gallery London on Leonardo at the Courts of Milan. And we were able to analyse the lines and show that what the materials were. So going back to our apparently blank drawing, when you look at this under ultraviolet light, a transformation takes place. Wow. And it's quite extraordinary to see. These very indistinct hands turn out to be pure Leonardo. They have all the characteristics. There's the left-handed hatching and so on. And we have, it's long been known that they were part of the campaign of studies for the Adoration of the Magi. So infrared reflectograms taken of details of that when it was being worked on at the Opificio delle Pietre Dure in Florence show that the drawings in the Windsor collection correspond very closely to elements of that image, although sometimes in reverse. And just to show the transformation of a detail. So the question is, just going back, the question is what is actually there? Because there appears to be nothing to the naked eye, and yet something is causing a difference in the way that the ultraviolet light is being reflected or absorbed. And one of the, well, we did some X-ray fluorescence analysis, which helped a little bit, but I was given the opportunity of going to the Diamond Light Source, which is the UK's synchrotron, and it might seem over the top technology-wise, but the point is that this is a device which accelerates electrons to nearly light speeds and produces a very wide spectrum of very, very, very bright light, brighter than the sun. But a very narrow beam, about the thickness of a credit card. So it's and what they do is they tap this electron beam at various points. When electrons travel very, very fast, they emit, amongst other things, they emit X-rays. And those X-rays can be focused and channeled and put into these what they call beam lines. So the electrons are whizzing around this inner ring here, and then they're tapped off at various points along these beam lines. And each one can do different things. They tap different different amounts of energy. So X-rays of different energy can be used for different purposes. And the idea is that the X-ray beam comes in through here. It's focused and filtered so you get a very precise energy level. And then some experimental work is done in this box here. And then it's analysed in this, what they call a hutch, which looks very neat and tidy inside, but in fact, it's like this. And I don't think what this stain on the floor is. They didn't explain that. They kept very quiet about it. I think it's probably a former employee or something. Anyway, what we did is we actually took 3 of the drawings. One, which we took this one because it had already been analysed that it was silver point. It was in ostensibly perfect condition and therefore would act as an exemplar of something which hadn't faded and which hadn't changed. What the experimental setup there is able to do is to produce a 2-dimensional scan of parts of the surface. And it produces an X-ray fluorescence spectrum. This is an average of over the whole of the scanning area. And in particular, you can see these peaks correspond to silver. And there should be another one down there as well. There's a load of other stuff. You've obviously got calcium from the bone. You've got little traces of copper and zinc, a bit of iron, a bit of lead, again from lead white in the thing. There's also, incidentally, traces of barium and strontium, which came from the fact that it was treated in the 1970s with barium hydroxide as an anti-acid system, something which is not generally done nowadays. However, it shows up. And this is the kind of scan you get. It's not wonderfully high resolution, and it's not like the kind of X-ray fluorescence scanners that have been developed since we did this. But here we got the traces for silver, and this is an enhanced one using a logarithmic process. So the images are very strongly silver with some copper and some mercury. It's found that mercury tends to bond with silver surfaces quite readily, so it's nearly always found in the analysis of these lines. This is another drawing which has both visible and invisible components. Under UV, you can see there's more horses in it than you thought, and we looked at two areas there. The first one is much like the one you saw before, so very strong signals for silver, but also a fair bit of copper. And it's quite possible that any silver stylus around in the late 1400s was likely not to be pure silver anyway, so there would be some copper present. But the invisible lines produce virtually no silver, but copper and zinc, implying some kind of copper alloy was used for the stylus. So here's the visible metal point, and you see again the same peaks for silver here and here, and then way down the other end, down there. And then this is the one for the invisible area. So the silver peak has gone, right? If I just flip back, you see the difference. So what's going on here? And we sort of concluded really that what he might have done was to use a stylus which was essentially a copper alloy, such as this one, which, as you can see, has a sort of brassy colour, which is tipped only with silver. And that the silver gradually wore away, but he carried on using it. That's a theory. I mean, it could have been a brass point rather than a silver point. There's nothing, brass makes a perfectly good line on a ground. Yeah, and also the phenomenon isn't entirely, it's visible in the work of other artists. This is a drawing by Raphael in the Royal Collection, which has the same kind of fading. And this one is quite interesting because it gives some kind of idea of the speed at which this fading may have occurred, because it's a double-sided drawing done originally in a metal point of some sort, possibly silver, possibly brass or copper point. And it was interesting because there is a set of drawings done by Dürer in Dresden, which includes this rather enigmatic apparent copy in reverse of a Leonardo drawing. Now, it's not documented that Leonardo and Dürer ever met, so it's very curious that this thing exists at all. But do you notice the difference here? This is how the bottom of this leg appears now, but in Dürer's day, he was able to copy more of the leg. So that must have still been visible in 1517 when it was dated. However, it's not the whole leg. It's very strange. So I'm going to mess around with it now. I flip the image, right, so that it's now in the same orientation as our other one. Note incidentally that he drew, this is a monkey's paw, in fact, not a human one, which he copied from one side of the drawing and not. So he must have had access to this drawing. I can't see how it would ever have happened. Anyway, if we now then, oh, sorry, that's a mistake there. So if we now take those two areas, right, and then look at that in ultraviolet light, you can see the rest of the foot. So it obviously was there originally, but had already faded by the time Dürer saw the drawing. So if we place together the drawing as it started out, with the foot and everything, as Dürer saw it, not very many years later, really, and then as it is now, it shows that this kind of fading can happen quite quickly, and I'm hoping Susan may make some comment about that in her. This one was interesting because it was catalogued by Clark as being a drawing in ink on a sort of brownish toned paper. But very easily you can see that it is actually a coated paper, with under fairly low magnification. There are also stylus marks on it. You can see the indentation of a stylus running all the way down the back of the head here. And looking at the ground, it's quite a nice colourful mixture, including iron oxide type browns, lapis lazuli, and even some malachite here, it would seem, as well as, of course, the ubiquitous bone here and the general coating probably of lead white that you see sort of nestling between the fibres of the paper. Again, quite a thinly made coating. And this one's interesting because this was on exhibition here some not very many years ago. Again, it's always been catalogued as a drawing in brush. Sorry, I should go back to that. Brush and black ink over a pale blue prepared paper. But in fact, I'm proposing here that in fact it's probably started off life as a metal point drawing. Again, you can see indentations here which don't correspond to the present day lines. There's all kinds of marks here which have been gone over. So it's just a theory. This is one of the sort of great iconic drawings in the collection. And the reason I just put this one in is, again, it shows the wonderful way in which Leonardo is working with this sort of fantastic energy of lines, these sort of wiry profusion of attempts to try and get the profile of this arm right and so on. But you can also see here this sort of soft grey smudgy material lurking around, and that and higher magnification resolves itself into charcoal again. So he must have used charcoal as the underdrawing, and most of it had been erased, but some of it has been retained by the interstices of the paper, the sort of holes between the fibres. We can also see bits of red lead here as part of the ground. So going back to this painting, just want to draw your attention to that, what appears to be the wing of a bird there. Why is that there? And the reason evidently would be that this artist posing as St. Luke was also doing an underdrawing in charcoal. The purpose of the wing is as a means of brushing away the charcoal. And just a few words about Leonardo's use of blind stylus, or dry point as it's sometimes called, not to be confused with dry point, the printmaking technique, but this is the use of possibly a steel stylus to mark out drawings, and he used it both as a geometrical marker, as a pointer for making distance measurements and so on. And we can see this readily in raking light, and this is on plain paper, of course. And we see it also in some of his preliminary drawings. Many Renaissance artists use this technique so they didn't have to rub it out afterwards. And if we look at the detail of the horse at the top centre, that's in normal balanced light. And this is in raking light, again with the ink lines digitally subtracted from the image, and we can see again the sort of vigorous use of a blind stylus here to mark out the drawing. So we've looked at a good number of these drawings in the collection. You've now had a closer look at getting on for half of the drawings there, and I hope it's given you some idea into the kinds of materials and techniques that Leonardo was using for metal point drawing. And finally, I'd like to thank all these people who helped at various stages with the work. Thank you all very much.
I have questions afterwards. Thank
Sure.
you, Helen. It was so lucid and so informative. I hope you continue to do more research along that line. So our next speaker is Susan. This one, I'm sorry. So our second speaker is Susan Schwalb, who is one of the foremost practitioners of the American revival of this ancient technique of silver point drawing. Her training as an artist dates to her high school years and continued at Carnegie Mellon University. She has held residencies in this country and abroad, and has had well over 50 solo exhibitions, and has participated in over 47 group shows, numbers that indicate how highly productive she is and how she has contributed to the new appreciation of this medium. Among the recent exhibitions in which her work has been included is the 2015 Drawing with Silver and Gold from Leonardo to Jasper Johns, which was organized by the National Gallery in Washington and the British Museum. And I'm sure many of you have seen it was just a magnificent exhibition. More recently, her exquisitely rich, lush panels as other works were included in Pushing Paper, Contemporary Drawing from 1970 to now, a traveling exhibition in Britain. Her work is represented in numerous major public collections here at the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the Brooklyn Museum, the National Gallery in Washington, the British Museum, Victoria and Albert, the Ashmolean, and in Berlin at the Kupferstich Cabinet, to mention only a very few. Susan's work is unique and innovative. She combines various metals that yield soft shifts in tone and color, and uses papers of beautiful, rich color, often burning and tearing them. Unlike most metal point artists who use the delicate line of the medium for figurative imagery, she employs metal points in a decidedly abstract manner, often juxtaposing silver point with broad expanses of acrylic paint or gold leaf, and she uses wide metal bands in preference to the narrow line of the stylus in many of her works. In addition to writing a number of book reviews, Susan has authored a book with Tom Mazzullo, also an outstanding metal point artist, entitled Silver Point and Metal Point Drawing, A Complete Guide to the Medium. It is a fascinating and highly informative manual on every detail of using metal point, including purchasing and preparing the materials, as well as offering a historical background. Copies of it, as Alan's book, are for sale in our bookshop, and you can also find some examples of Susan's prints for sale in the mezzanine gallery on the second floor. I should mention that we have copies of both books, Alan's and Susan's, on the table if you want to take a quick look at them after the talk. So let's welcome Susan.
I got so caught up in Alan's talk, I forgot I was speaking here today. But my talk is not only about my work, although I will, let's see, what happened? Oh, I touched this and it did something. The first part of the talk is about a little bit of contemporary history, and I'll show you tools and ways of preparing surfaces, some images from our book, some of mine images, and some contemporary artists, and then I'll do an overview of my 40 plus years in this medium. So I normally open my talk with the Roger van der Weyden beautiful painting of St. Luke drawing the Virgin, but you've seen it twice. So I open my talk with this fantastic drawing by Rembrandt. And if you haven't seen it, you have to go to Berlin to see it. And, you know, the medium died out, a lot of reasons, paper, red chalk, black chalk availability. There's a lot of theories about it, but Rembrandt still drew a number of beautiful drawings. And this one, which is blown up hugely, is an exquisite teeny drawing that I almost fainted when I saw it in Berlin. So how did a silver point get from Europe and get here? The pre-Raphaelites began working in the medium because they were interested in everything Renaissance. And Dewing is the person who transferred the medium, I believe, to America. He taught many people in the Boston area, and then the medium began to spread. There were other artists in Europe who came here. Cholochov is another one. So let me see. And one of my favorite artists in this period from the medium is Joseph Stella, with his exquisite drawings of flowers, as well as, this was supposed to show me what was coming next. I guess I'll have to just wing it because it's not doing it here. I don't know why. So let's see. So the other artist that, of course, you know, who has used metal point in a more traditional way, and what is Paul Cadmus. And what I love is that he did the coating vertically, but did the drawing horizontally. And I think that's unusual. Most artists I know want the brushstrokes of the ground to disappear. They sand the surfaces. Certainly I do. But a number of artists, which include Cadmus and other contemporary artists, just didn't care, and the brushstrokes are quite visible. Back. So this is a significant show that changed metal point in America. And I don't think Bruce Weber has made it here, although I invited him. But this seminal show that started at the Norton Museum of Art and traveled to a number of museums, and this catalog with the great Stella drawing. And this is an amazing drawing, and when you see it, because Stella was so free when he worked that he tore the surface of the paper. It was just part of the drawing. But there were many silver point artists in America at this point, but this exhibition, which traveled, and the catalog, caused a tremendous number of artists to get interested in the medium and move on with it. One of my favorite earlier artists was Leo D., whose work is, even with a magnifying glass, I could not see really what the lines were. And I mean, it just was so detailed, the surface on his drawings. A mentor of mine and dear friend, the late Paula Gerard, who studied in Europe and worked originally on commercial papers that were available in Europe, lived in the Chicago area and taught a number of artists in that region. This piece, which is quite small, is on parchment, emulating traditional use, but not. And what Paula did is that she floated watercolor on the surface, and then she drew into it to create these abstract worlds and landscapes. One of my other favorites, and who also see these artists, when I first started in this medium in the 70s, I didn't know anything about the medium, and I looked for other art and artists. There was almost no books, and I discovered that where there was a major artist like Paula, like John Wilde, that is where artists learn the medium. So the Chicago area, many people studied with Paula. Wilde was in Michigan, and again, taught many people in I'm blocking the name of a number of well-known artists who studied with him. And even Jasper Johns took this medium up in the 80s, and although he only made a handful of drawings, I think they're extremely beautiful. So what are the tools? For me, these are some of my tools. All kinds of things, wait a minute, it's this. So whether it's a piece of metal or a silver fork, the metal there is gold. And here, Alan was talking about lead point. And here's my lead point tool and my tin point tool. You can buy them at Zecchi in Florence. They can ship them to you. Our book has a whole list of where you can find silver point tools and materials in it. Artists, and you'll see later, even draw with silver thimbles. And to see what you think about in silver point is all the different metal point, all the different colors of metal. And this isn't a bad example of, though I have some better things, where you can see on a white ground a number of different metals. However, when you do the metals on a black ground or a dark ground, it's totally different. And I have a small drawing of mine similar to this piece, where the metals, this is actually the copper becoming very red like the metal itself, and gold looks goldy, silver, silvery, aluminum, that's probably aluminum. And it's amazing what happens with these different kinds of surfaces. So in talking about tarnishing of metals, we included this drawing and a detail particularly. So here's this green tarnishing, because usually copper tarnishes yellow. Sometimes, and I think in the invisible drawings that Alan showed, they were done in copper point because that can happen. On some grounds, the copper just tarnishes into oblivion. But in this case, this is all copper point, but there it is, a little green strip. And I didn't notice it till many years later. Why? I have no idea. A drawing I brought here today, I noticed this morning as I was choosing which of my burnt works to bring that I had one with a little bit of green in it. It's the same thing. Why? How? I have no idea. Yet you can force the tarnishing effect. I've never tried this. I'm allergic to sulfur, so there would be no way I would use a sulfur box. But it's very common for artists who want to push the tarnishing to do this. And here you can see where they're before and afterwards. And I've seen actually someone I know was able to make something green by doing it with this method. I don't have a slide of it. So what are we drawing with? Loads of different kinds of wire at different thicknesses. Now, Tom's points are always, my partner in crime, are always these super fine, very, very carefully polished and sharpened tools. I do some like that, but I just tend to take the tool as is. So one way to sharpen the tool is to use a file here. Tom showed me how he sharpens the tools. I'm too impatient to make the drawing to sharpen all my tools this well. So I tend to use a sharpening stone. It works a little faster. And I'm using Arkansas sharpening stones. I'm assuming it's used for sharpening knives primarily, but you can order them from Arkansas. And we have a variety of different possible points that an artist might use, flat, round. And some of my other tools, and I did for over 10 years, a lot of drawings from my Strata series using flat pieces of metal. It eventually damaged my hand, so I wound up creating something to hold the pieces of metal. But eventually that didn't work either, and I had to move on. So this is a good example of some tarnishing where you can see it's just as I've written here. It's silver, gold, doesn't tarnish, so it's a kind of gray. Copper and brass. All the metals, when you put them down on a white surface, all look grayish. It just has to evolve over time. How fast? How long? Well, if you live in a nice, humid area in the summer, like New York or Massachusetts, where the humidity is very high, it might tarnish overnight. If you live in Denver or in the desert, it may never tarnish because there's no humidity. We need the pollution in the air and the humidity to make this happen. I described at lunch how I have forced something to tarnish by steaming up a bathroom with a hot shower, turn the shower off, put the artwork in the room, let it be there for a little while, hope the water pad, doesn't get on the actual artwork. And sometimes that works. So here are some of more recent tools. I use loads of these different kinds of brushes. This copper one was sent to me. I collect everything silver point. Tools, artists, drawings. I don't even know what I'm going to do with them, but I do find out later. And someone sent me this one who came to visit me. It's used to clean guns. So, but the rest of the tools are more artist-oriented or woodworking tools. And then you can buy these metal pads, like a steel wool pad, only it's finer, and of course it's in metals rather than steel. Really doesn't work. It doesn't really make a mark. And here you can see a selection of marks made with some of my brushes and metallic wools. The artist Linda Hutchins, who lives in the West Coast, makes drawings with silver thimbles, and she's very inspired by, wrong thing. So this is a recent piece. She is very inspired by Cage music, John Cage's music, and has made work. The other work she's done, which I have always been interested in is that she works with a metal silver spoon and did wall drawings using this. So grounds. This is really a big choice. You couldn't even use house paint. I am using a lot of acrylic grounds these days, Holbein gesso and other things, but I often use Golden's black gesso to make the ground. So if you're going to make a traditional ground, and my co-author, all of his grounds are handmade, so he's combining pigment with rabbit skin glue and boiling it up, etc. I have done this. It's very laborious, I find, and so it's less of interest to me. Anyway, I'm not really looking these days for a lot of white grounds. So in the case here, I'm using a bottle of the Golden Silver Point ground. I don't love it, although I actually have some drawings that are done with it, and it surprises me how nice it looks because I usually think it's an uneven ground. But it is a way, I often recommend it to young people who are starting in the medium to just plunge in so that they don't have to spend a lot of time making a ground. When you're painting on a ground, you want the consistency of homogenized milk. And then when you're coating the surface, so in this case, I'm using a very soft, wide brush, one direction, then another. Sanding, I sand between coats of gesso. I work a lot on wood panels. So here's one of them. And I've been using a painter's roller lately to put the gesso down, trying to get as smooth a surface as possible. It doesn't always work. I have an assistant who does it better, but I'm losing her, so I don't know what to do. And then, of course, I want to sand the surface beforehand. Most artists want as smooth a surface as possible, but there are artists historically that I've known over the 40 plus years of my being involved in this medium, some who wanted to work on very rough paper, some who wanted to work on canvas. And so it really isn't a rule what you should do. It's a matter of what kind of artwork you want to make. And so with a stylus like this, a very fine piece of silver, you really don't have to sharpen that at all. You just have to watch that the burr on the edge doesn't tear your surface. So here I am making a mark with one of my flat pieces of copper. So thinking of teachers who taught a lot of people is Roger Anlecker. Roger used to spend 10 years on a drawing. I am so glad I never studied with Roger when he taught at Carnegie Mellon. I didn't know him because students have told me, former students, that they had to spend a month making a ground and polishing it, etc. I would have never done metal point if I had to do that. I admire his work. It's absolutely exquisite, but he was a real traditionalist when it comes to the technique. A former student of his, a little more free, Dale, who's washes things in here and then pulls out the drawing. Another artist who doesn't even use line. He uses a kind of I don't know what I want to say, makes a fuzzy surface is what it really is. And Mike, he lives in Indiana where he teaches and is a specialist in fresco painting. So he is very interested in traditional technique. New York artist moved back to Florida, has combined metallic leaf with metal point. I really like this portrait because it's not traditional and just gives us a piece of the face. I mean, I like more abstract work, but I admire craft. And if the work is really beautiful, I'll love it. So one of the most traditional artists I know is Koo Shadler, who gives lots of workshops on traditional tempera, egg tempera, and metal point. But she does find a way to make this allusion to an old drawing contemporary. The California artist, Kathleen, it's with an R, isn't it? Verne, does a lot of metal sculpture. She considers this a portrait, and I really like the kind of melting glass here. One of the most amazing artists in metal point is Victor Kublak. And Victor is represented in New York by Dieter Aron Gallery, and I don't see Alan here. He must be selling art today because of the old master drawings in all the galleries. But this work, I don't know if this piece is up, but Victor's work is almost always up in the gallery, so I advise you to take a look at it. What I like here is it very added with watercolor, but you can still see his silver point drawing here. Victor lives between Malta and Paris. He's a Russian-born and has paper specially made for himself. And I've never been able to interview him about his technique, although Alan did for me, so I could write about it. So another contemporary artist taking a traditional crosshatching, making it his own and making it very modern is Tom Otherness, known for his humorous sculpture. The artists, there's a lot of silver point artists in Little Rock because that Fine Line show went there. And Marjorie's work is absolutely exquisite. I own a piece that is on a white ground, just part of a flower disappearing into the background. But she came on a research grant to meet me, and even though we had corresponded for years as pen pals, and began to work on black grounds, getting very unusual technique. Her husband also does metal point, and his interest is portraiture, primarily of people living in the Delta is what he's been working on in recent years. New Jersey artist Laurie Field is part of the surrealist and imaginary bent of this medium. I think about her work in relation to John Wilde. And Kate Krantz made a whole series of works on metal, so on silver bowls, on silver cups. She's doing extraordinarily dangerous political work these days, if you look her up online. She's very affected by the times we're living. And the London artist, Erica Winstone, who does giant works on the wall and combines them with video projections. So I consider this work very unusual, and she's working on canvas. As I mentioned, some people are. Living in Florida is the amazing artist Carol Prusa, who works on these large plastic domes. So that's Carol. And these are 3 versions of the same piece. Often she has little lights in it or videos that light up. Living in Florida and teaching there is Ron Janowitz. And what I find amazing with this work, so he's made this very careful drawing and then he flings paint on it. I could never do this. It's scary, but he does it all the time. And the London artist who's shown here by Davidson Gallery in Chelsea does these beautiful, beautiful detailed large silver point drawings. This is a medium size. I've seen wall size drawings at art fairs by him. Now living in upstate is Robin Ellenbogen's work, who's using a lot of colored grounds, combining all kinds of lines and medium. And the German artist, Lucy Biepler, who also carves into the surface. I've yet to see an actual drawing. She's represented by the same gallery I have in London, but I admire the work enormously. I hope someday I get to meet her. And the Israeli artist living in London is working on this plastic terraskin or stone paper, making very 3-dimensional works. He also runs something in Plymouth, England, called performance drawing, where people draw in many ways. I don't know. I see it all online and I don't totally understand what it is, but the outcome looks very interesting. And last but not least is my co-author, Tom Mazzullo, who does many kinds of drawings, so often does animals or bugs, but I particularly like his drawings of paper. Tom is actually a figurative artist copying the way he's got his models set up, but they come out very abstract to me. And he was a perfect person to do the book with because we came at this medium from very different directions. So, how am I doing? Oops, I wanted to start here. So I never started out to spend more than 40 years on this technique. It's all by accident. People ask me all the time, how did you find this? Well, I didn't study it. I was working with ink and watercolor drawings, and I was still doing some etching prints. And I was visiting friends in the Hamptons, and I said, what are you doing? And she said, oh, it's a silver point tool. Here, make a mark on my paper. And a few weeks later, I'm back in the city, and I go to the then New York Central, buy some paper, and started to work. And so I am self-taught. Loads of artists have advised me. I've looked at many drawings, and it's been a very long and exciting journey that I seem to be still on. So my first major body of work was this orchid series using dried orchids as my models. Gradually, I decided I would work on what was behind these forms behind the flower, and began a series of drawings that I eventually did other things to. When it says clay-coated paper here, the first papers I worked on were as a commercial paper called video media paper. I've removed that in general from when I talk about the work because that paper is long gone. I just inherited some from an artist who died a year ago. But you can't buy it, you can't find it. I don't know who manufactured it. So I have chosen to call it clay-coated paper because that's what it is. And because I started to have artists contact me, well, where can I buy it? Where can I find it? And I have samples of it here. I have loads of samples. But I would love it if someday, somebody would take it on. But in this day and age where everything's online, I don't know about a new kind of paper. Many years ago, when the paper was stopped being manufactured, and in fact, it was used by our government it's a very heavy coated paper, and they used to do, I've been told, schematics on it, drawings, and that they could scrape it off, etc. And this is before the internet, before Facebook groups with 700 artists as members, where he said to me, well, we could manufacture it, but I'd have to make 1,500 sheets. And I couldn't pay for that. Today I could. But I don't know. I lost the materials. I don't know who the man was who was doing this. And I'm selling my house. Maybe when I clean up everything, maybe somewhere in my house is this piece of information. So I began to tear into the surfaces of my paper, and these are small drawings, and gradually began to burn the surface and use smoke and fire in my drawings. I was very interested in Native American rituals. I was very involved with the feminist art movement at the time of these works. When Bruce Weber, who wrote the catalog essay of my retrospective from 2018 at the Arkansas Art Center, asked me, why did I start? I could hardly tell him. I looked through my journals, I found a few sentences, but it really doesn't explain it to me. And I can't remember completely why I first burnt my first drawing and why I began to smoke it. And it's not that I had seen other drawings, although there are other artists who've used fumage on the surfaces of their work. And I did a lot of these, and they were mostly on this beautiful video media paper because it burnt well and it took the smoke well, etc. And when I started the series, I thought, I have a finite amount of paper. I had bought whatever I could buy when Arthur Brown and New York Central was selling out this paper. And I just thought, well, when I come to the end of it, I'll find something else to do. So there's new interest in this work. To be honest with you, I thought this work was going to make my career. I thought it was so amazing. This was going to do it. And I never had a solo show of this work, and it's hardly been shown. Odd little group shows. But there is some renewed interest, and I've got my fingers crossed. So, I mean, the fact that it's headdress, I have books on feathers. I was interested in lots of kind of traditional ceremonies. This is long before I went to the Southwest and actually saw them in person. And in this work, which was extremely fragile, I mean, if you put your finger here, you had a fingerprint on your drawing. So eventually, I couldn't go on with this work, but I did and this is image work I have never shown, and I hope one day to show. Bruce Weber wanted to include it. This is the piece he wanted in Washington at the historical show. But they said, no, too big, too much, something smaller. So instead, there was a strata drawing, which I will show you, or show you a similar work to. But I still have this in a flat file. And, I thought about framing it, but I'm not even sure how to do it. And so I never did. I just keep it until I hope someday I can show it and some major museum will acquire it. But a lot of the smaller multiple part works, I did a lot of triptychs, and this was in my retrospective, these two pieces. So at some point, it's not that I completely ran out of paper, but I began to want to do something else. And I went back to my traditional stylus, began to coat paper again. And this is an extremely large drawing for metal point. It is not the largest drawing in metal point. John Wilde once did a 6-foot wide drawing that was in the fine line drawing with Silver in America. And Ram in England is trying to make the largest silver point drawing in the world, but I don't know if he's succeeded as yet. He hasn't told me. So this combines, I believe, tempera along with silver point. And that is primarily what I used. Eventually, I used a lot of copper point and then began to use every metal I could think of. And I began to add gold leaf to some of my work here. I'm self-taught in the application of gold leaf. So some works use the traditional red boil and floating water and a resist, and some use contemporary glue where you paint it down and it gets sticky. And so you can put the leaf right on it. And since I'm not a traditionalist, I didn't necessarily want it to be pristine smooth. I was thrilled to have such a thing. I did show these, but, I think as a woman artist who worked on paper for a great deal of her life, this was a hindrance in the 70s and in the 80s to have the career that I have a career. On paper, and I mean, I have a career, but it's not what it might have been had we been living in different times. Now, my London dealer doesn't understand why a big gallery in New York hasn't just rediscovered me like they have been of many women artists these days, where you see shows, retrospectives of artists that I've known all along that all of a sudden the art world is discovering. And I'm still hoping that will happen. But I'm not holding my breath. I just keep working. So I began to use a lot of acrylic grounds. Originally, I used things like Chinese white watercolor paint or casein. But this is primarily when I wanted only a white ground. I started adding color grounds because the more you look at Renaissance drawing, you see all the colors. And I would see all these drawings at the Morgan particularly. And I would think, I'm going to take some of these ideas, because every artist steals from other artists. We just get better ideas from them. And that's some of the reasons that I began to do colored grounds from the beginning. In this case, this has the traditional application of the gold leaf, but you can see the red boil creeping through. I was happy to see that. And it's an absolutely beautiful drawing. I did a very large series very large sized series. Because I've always done, at one point, very big drawings of metal point. It's in contrast to what you normally see, little, small, careful drawings. And this is the only one I've shown. And I showed it in my retrospective because somehow a year's worth of work never got shown. I think I'm not many artists who have bodies of work that somehow didn't get shown enough. I have some bodies of work shown a lot. I've sold a lot, but it really depends. So here's a series that I combined metal point with gold leaf, and in the piece, we're back here. So this drawing is inspired by a poplar drawing by Monet. And the areas here became this. It's like I took a little section and enlarged it and changed it, and then did a very huge piece. This piece was last shown at Yeshiva University Museum on 16th Street. It somehow squeaked into a show about leaving the land fallow at the 7th year, because it looks a lot like wheat or something else, even though it's an abstract work. And I was glad to see it up. This body of work, I had one show of all the panels. These are all on masonite panels up at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. There was a snowstorm the day of the opening, so only my husband and I and the director of the gallery were there, but it stopped, and eventually students and faculty saw this work. So I'd been drawing and making drawings with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines, and I began to think about something else. I always knew you could use a flat piece of metal and make a mark with it, which has more of an illusion of watercolor or of chalk or something else. And I happened to see a drawing made in watercolor of bands of tone. And I thought, eureka, I'm going to do this. And so I spent from around 1996 until 2010 making this strata series. And this is what was in, not this drawing, but one very similar. I don't know if I have it here. We'll see what happens. Was in the show in Washington in the National Gallery. And I used many different metals. A lot of the series was still done on that special video media paper until I used it all up practically. But not always in this piece. And I had been trying I did the work on masonite, and I wanted my work to lose the frame. I don't like frames. I don't like glass. I don't like plexi in front of a work. It just, you see yourself in it, even with the best of these things. So I was looking to have my work free of the frame and began working on wood panels, which I still do today. In the early part of this series, I glued paper down on the panels. You pretty much can't see that I did it. I didn't make a drawing and glue it down. I glued the paper. I coated the surfaces with 6 or 8 coats of gesso and then drew on it. I've also done artist books, and 2 of my books were in my retrospective because I based this part of my talk on that retrospective. This This scroll book I did in collaboration with the composer Martin Boykin, my husband, who's in the audience today. So we have it's a big long scroll of 72 inches, and we have a CD that you can hear the piece. I have one last project that I hope to do. I got distracted by many things in the last 4 years, but I have an idea that maybe next year I'll go back to printmaking, because Marjorie mentioned that I've made prints, and I went back to printmaking in anticipation of doing a major artist book in it, but I haven't done that yet. I've done the prints, and the Met delightfully owns them. So this is one of the few series of works that relates to a specific event, to 9/11. Because I was devastated. I was not in New York City. I was in Massachusetts. I came back here about a week and a half after the explosions. And those of you who are from New York and were here at that time know how horrible the city was then. I mean, all the posters of all the missing people. You could still smell smoke. I live at 21st Street. I could smell the smoke from Ground Zero. You could still go there. I went with a friend from the Bronx who felt as disconnected because she watched it on television as I. And we went, you had to walk from 14th Street down to that area. And then I took a bus all over the city. And I mean, we're not unpatriotic here, but you wouldn't think that the motif of the American flag was a prominent image in New York City, but it was then. Every store window had the flag on it. I mean, I never saw such big flags as I saw then. And I wrote about my experience and my reaction, which I shared with friends who didn't live in New York, because people in New York knew what happened here. And at the end of it, I said, maybe I should do something in red, white, and blue. And that's when I did this series. Of course, I have layers of paint, red, blue, and we topped it as gray. Now, after I made this series, and I did it on paper as well on panel, most of the works on paper from this series are sold or in private collections or museums. But it's at the end of this series, somebody pointed out to me that this resembled something about the architecture of the World Trade Center. Actually, it's vertical stripy lines. This is a horizontal work. I had been in the World Trade Center once to have a drink at the top of the building and passed through the downstairs in the subways, of course. And it is intentional that these marks look like gashes or wounds. So it is, you know, I don't consider myself an artist who always relates to something that happens. Usually I'm inspired by nature and other art that I see, by color. And so at any rate, there's more strata because this went on quite a distance. And mostly everything at this point is in a square format, but occasionally I made a vertical drawing. But to today, it's still a square format. And I've worked on a lot of commercial papers. This is a Plike paper, and which I like. It comes in lots of colors, or liked, I should say, because there was a defect in some of this paper, and I don't highly recommend it anymore because some of my drawings became invisible, Alan. I have a piece. This is a piece that, by the way, is using these wools. You can see that they turn into this, fuzzy surface. I get a kind of tone. And a piece, now this was done on this ivory paper. This is still okay. But there was a section of this paper, maybe it was a second batch that I bought, I don't really know. But I have a series of drawings where it's almost invisible in certain spots. The gold tarnished to invisible, and that shouldn't happen. Gold never tarnishes, never disappears. Occasionally copper does, but so that I think it was in something within the manufacturing of the paper. I really don't know what caused it. And I destroyed some drawings, some I've just left, partially invisible, partially present. And this is a piece that's on a triptych that's on wood panels. And another book project that I've done is I've done several of these where I use either 50 or 100 drawings in the box. And I did these small drawings after I was in, SF MoMA. I was just checking the time on this, where I saw these gigantic paintings of Ansel Kiefer and other artists. And I just looked at all of these works that are 12 feet high and 40 feet wide or whatever. And I think I'm going to make the smallest drawings that I can make. And so I made these box full of drawings. And I still have them. I think they belong in a museum, and the price is a little prohibitive for the average consumer, but 100 drawings is, I don't know, what is it, $10,000? And it's like $100 a little drawing, but it adds up. And it's in a little leather, beautiful case as well. So I also have added colored paper, colored pencil, besides different metals in combination. Just an example of this work. And backing up here a minute. So in 2010, I had to change my work. I had to go back to a more linear, less using of flat pieces of metal. And it's because I damaged my hand. And I mean, I persisted, I had cortisone shots, but eventually I had to try something else. And this is what is the result. There are many other drawings where I went back to the stylus. I'm using a straight edge mostly, although here's some of my prints. Most of my early works are all freehand. I only used a straight edge to make, if it has a frame, to make the square form. And so these are some of the series of prints that I made. I'm showing you the ones that the museum owns, and it owns this lovely group of 4 images, as does the mezzanine store. I think they have a selection of these. So now what am I doing when I have colored grounds? Well, I'm making them myself now. Now I'm making all my grounds. So I'm not making it from scratch. I'm using acrylic gessos, but I just don't trust all the commercial papers as I used to. So this is a relatively new series. You can see something about the panels. They all bevel back. In the case of several of these pieces, I have color on the edge of the panels. And to see this piece from the side. And on the black ground, you can see the iridescence of the color. These works, they look three-dimensional, actually, when you see them. People want to touch them because they somehow think that they're in layers or something, but they are flat. But of course, I drew them in layers. And a very recent piece, sometimes I make drawings that are almost invisible. And I can't explain why I would do this, except that they're just gorgeous. And I had these mauve grounds. I just finished another piece like this. And, I trained as a graphic designer. So I know something about reproduction and about seeing work in print. And that really didn't affect me as an artist because I like having a very subtle and intimate surface that makes you get very close to look at the lines, to fall into them. That's always the way I've thought about my work over these 40 plus years. And I don't do very large work. This is about the largest because if it's a wood panel, I can barely lift this 30-inch panel. I have done a lot of multiple things. I have panels where they're triptychs, diptychs, and I eventually will go back to that perhaps. So this series, this harmonization series, which it started with mostly horizontal lines or vertical lines. I've now more recently picked up some other tools and I'm making a lot of swirls and curvy lines and mixing up the metals. And here's a piece on white. This is a commercial paper that I think is stable, although I can't be sure, this TerraSkin paper, which is a kind of plastic. It's made of stone, but it has a kind of plastic surface. You can't tear the paper. You can cut it with a scissors or a knife, but you can't tear it. And here's a very recent panel on purple gesso on a wood panel. And I end you with a picture of my book, which is around here. I hope you'll share images about the book. I have some flyers if you don't wind up buying it in the store here. I was so glad that the Met would take them. The National Gallery was selling the book. Also, Kramer Pigments that Marjorie mentioned, who was here to talk at the pastel panel. I did a talk there in October, and they sold 35 books in a day there. So it was really exciting. And they are continuing to try to carry some silver point and metal point materials, because with New York Central closing, the source for most artists in an art store has disappeared. And there are online stores, naturalpigments.com, Silver Point Web, but to actually see the papers and touch the things and look at the materials, that's disappearing, which is really sad for artists coming up now that can't kind of fall on these materials and find them. And I know Marjorie didn't mention this, but I'm wearing my art on my sleeve and on my back today. A company in Montreal has been contacting artists to say, lend us your images and we'll turn them into clothing. And so I am wearing one of my drawings. I thought it would be a fun thing to do. I wasn't sure whether to do it. My husband said, that doesn't sound professional enough. But didn't Judy Chicago, it seems to me, just collaborate with Dior? I'm not collaborating with Dior. It's Les Galeristes. And I have placemats with my drawing on it. They have pillows, they have clothing, and there's a lot of interesting artists whose work is on this website. It's really entertaining, and I get a teeny cut of the proceeds, not serious money, but I thought it was a fun thing to do. So thank you very much.
A couple of questions, or a few minutes, I should say.
Maybe for Ellen or Don?
Yeah, Ellen, you could put these chairs, well, we can stand.
Yeah, we'll just stand here.
Okay.
I mean, don't you think the invisible drawings, invisible marks that you're finding, I was thinking about that, came from copper probably?
Yes, all this.
I mean, because that's what I would think.
Can you talk to the microphone, will you be just a, yeah, thanks.
If you incorporated that intentionally, will you know that?
No, I wouldn't intentionally want my work to disappear. I make very subtle drawings. But if it disappears, there's nothing I can do about it. I could try to redraw it, but it doesn't look right. It's very hard to do that.
Leonardo.
Yeah.
Parts of it still doesn't look right.
There's somebody in the back.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear this?
Not very well.
Just turn the mic on, the bottom button, look it up. Okay.
Okay, thank you. My question for Alan, I had two questions. First, I was interested to hear your analysis that the coarse white particles you see in the photomicrographs of Leonardo's grounds were the particles of burned bone. Could you also visually identify the lead white particles? And could you differentiate between the two?
Yes, indeed. The thing is that the bone particles tended to be very roughly ground, hardly ground at all, almost. And for that matter, not very burnt either. Some of them almost look, like the appearance of a tooth. They still appear to have a lot of the organic material still in them. So again, I think it's this business of Leonardo wanting a result, not wanting to spend a lot of time making stuff, and probably probably even some of them are not bones at all, but just ground up bone, I think.
But isn't that what Cimini says? Take the bones as you find them under your
But put them in the
table?
fire, he says.
Oh,
so
see, that's the fire.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've tried this myself. I mean, I don't eat meat, but somebody who does gave me some chicken bones, and I burnt them up, and it works perfectly well. But it is, it is quite hard to get all the carbon out of it. You've got to really have a high temperature fire. But the white lead, because it's a synthetic pigment, has very much finer particles than the bone, and so it forms a sort of smooth mass on the surface of the paper. So it's not so easy to distinguish the individual particles.
Okay, thank you. And my second question had to do with an image that you showed where it was a raking light image where you had subtracted the metal point just to show the incising that
Yes.
the tool had left. I was wondering what process you used to do that
Oh, it's
digital subtraction.
Yeah, it's just playing about in Photoshop. If you take the same image with balanced light, so coming from both sides at 45 degrees, and then the same one with an image coming from one side only, you can superimpose one in a layer above the other, and then subtract one from the other. It's a very straightforward process, as long as your two images coincide. If you take them in different circumstances, then it's very hard to get to resize one to fit the other, and so you don't get a very easy result. But it's not a difficult thing to do.
Thank you so much. I had a question for Alan. Two questions, just like Christy. The watermarks that dated to 1300, you quoted briquet. And could you tell us where they were, what that paper was, or where that was, where the
Yes, there
sheet
was
was
only the
formed?
one watermark that seemed to date from that period. It was an Italian paper. Sorry, I can't. It's in the book, but I can't quite remember the location of the manuscript, which had the same watermark that Briquet copied. Of course, you can't always rely on these things, and watermarks may well have been copied from one mold maker to another, and the same things could have been used over a longer period. But certainly the manuscript that had a pretty closely matching watermark was from that date.
And then my second question is related to mercury. And you made a comment about how mercury will bond
Yes.
to silver. And where exactly is the mercury coming from?
From the atmosphere, surprisingly.
Wow.
There might be only a few atoms of mercury lurking around, but my understanding is that's what happens. Yeah, there's enough vapor there to cause some kind of absorption by the silver layer, and then it forms an amalgam.
I'm still just so puzzled by the drawing that was copied by Durer and there was partial.
It's hard to hear. She needs to press something.
Puzzled by the.
That's it.
Okay. By the drawing that was partially faded when Durer copied
Yes.
it and then continued to fade. So indicating that it really is a process of fading. But do you have any more comments you can, or anybody can make on that topic? Why?
It's hard to understand what is actually happening chemically, because whatever it was drawn with, some trace of it still remains in the paper, but it's not visible to the naked eye. And one theory is that it was something like a copper alloy, which deposited particles on the line, and then those have changed through oxidation, whatever, and crystallized into something which is transparent. And that's the most likely explanation, chemically speaking. Yeah. So you've got the very, very tiny distribution of transparent-ish crystals of a copper salt or a copper stroke zinc salt still in the paper. And it may well have even migrated into the paper if the material was hygroscopic. I don't know. It's never been satisfactorily explained as to why why you can't see it anymore. Because if you think about it, most copper salts are either very brightly coloured or they're black. So they should be visible, really. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, like most
Yeah.
artists that who talk about copper being the underdrawing, because I've read this and I know of artists who've done it. I've never done that because I don't really see my copper point drawings disappear, except on this freaky thing of this commercial paper that I use. Because I mean, now I only have since 1973 to today artworks. So I don't know what another 50 or a couple of hundred years will do. But other artists do say that, first of all, they draw lightly with copper, and certainly you can read that where people suggest that, where they're expecting it to disappear and they're drawing over it with silver. So I don't know. This is the mystery of metal point drawing. It is not an exact science.
And so they're using it somewhat like a blind line.
Yeah.
So it's an underdrawing.
Yeah, I've read that. I've never
Makes
done it.
sense.
I've heard people, artists say they do that. I just don't do it.
Have you noticed that these rounds are subject to any form of deterioration, flaking, or very tightly bound?
It seems to me that they're actually very stable, and I think part of it is that he used quite a thin layer, and there isn't a build-up of layers, so you can't get the sort of cleavage that you get in thicker layers of materials generally. So the bond to the paper is quite good. You get these surface cracks, but and clearly there is a vulnerability there. And also you saw how thin some of the grounds were. They were almost like a scattering of quite coarse particles on the surface of the paper. And so there's some vulnerability to abrasion through handling and so on of those. But otherwise, they are in very good condition. I mean, they have been well kept. I'm not saying, this isn't trying to sort of beef up the quality of control and preservation in the Royal Library. It's simply that most of them were mounted in an album in the 1500s, and they were preserved in that album until the early 1900s, and so they were protected from handling.
And from light and from
exactly,
humidity.
Yep. And to some extent from the effects of pollution. But they had been exposed to some pollution because in many cases the white lead had turned brown or black, as white lead does. But on the whole, they are in fact in very good condition.
I realize you said you haven't studied other artists in the same depth you've done
No.
Metal Point, but just from your experience, is Leonardo's type of ground distinctive to his work? The coarse ground, the very
No, I would say it's not that distinctive. I've looked at works by Lorenzo di Credi and Fra Bartolomeo, Gozzoli, a few others which happen to be in the Royal Collection. They're much the same. You get different degrees of thickness. There's one that's attributed to Fra Angelico, which is a very thick ground, and in transmitted light there's a lot of swirling of brushwork. So it looks very different. Otherwise, they look very similar to Leonardo's. And also the work of his pupils, Boltraffio and so on. The metal points they produced look indeed very similar, but they would have been taught how to do it by Leonardo, presumably.
When you were looking at some of the analysis, you're talking about the strontium and the other material that you thought came from the treatment, barium. Thank you. Isn't there a lot of strontium that exists in calcium or calcite?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, that will be a source of it as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But calcium, strontium, and barium are all in the same periodic table group, so they're always contaminators of each other.
Here's a question for Susan. Now, when you deal with those very large supports, the very large paper sizes, if you're not using a band of metal, this must be very challenging if you're just using a stylus, or is there something that you left
I
out?
used to have them on an easel,
Yeah.
and I would just stand there and draw at them, or have them I work on a flat table. These days I have to be careful with one's back. I work on a drafting table that is pretty tilted
Mm-hmm.
to do this. how did I make those really big drawings?
No,
It's a long time ago. I don't know how. I
No,
made
it's
them.
just that the stylus point is an arrow. And
I just built it up with a million lines. Those
Mhm.
were hundreds and hundreds of lines to get the surface.
probably hundreds of hours too.
Yeah, they
Makes-
used to take about a month at least to make a
Mhm.
drawing like that. I don't know. People always want to know how long it takes for artists to make things. When you know what you're doing and it's not the first one, it goes fast. When you don't know what you're doing, it goes slow.
And another question, why, since so many metals offer, different properties and colors, why has there always been a preference, or I think, for silver point? What are its properties that make it so desirable?
Well, it gets that warm, beautiful brown color, and it's the tarnishing gray to the warm brown. But I think it's just because people only know about that. I think that's when you talk about metal point drawing, people always use the word silver point drawing as the generic word, but it's
that-
not.
I don't know. Maybe that's what's been
That-
reported in a little bit that's.
I think artists, haven't been necessarily offered all these possibilities until they start to see other people's work and see, oh, what other metal? And, and when I had my show in Arkansas Art Center in Little Rock, they put out a thing to paper and metals, of all kinds for people coming to the exhibition to test because people were curious. And I mean, I gave a talk there, but I didn't do a lot of demos and things. And she put out, what was it, zinc and of screws of different metals. And I said to Tom, this has to get into the book. I've never used this. We better get some, I mean, and I only recently have incorporated a zinc metal, which is an alloy, but it's still into a drawing, So it's a matter of process. Now, I know with the book we have now that any artist who comes on this book to start learning metal point is introduced to a ton of material because there was no book, not since Cellini, that tried to put together, and I don't say we have absolutely everything, but we have a lot of how you might do this. I mean, we do still get calls. People are emailing, well, I want to do this and I want to do that, and how can I do it? And we try to answer it. I don't always know the answer.
On that note, now I thank you for your contributions to all of us and the future generations of artists, and giving advice like that liver of sulfur tank. I'm very concerned about like how porous the grounds for metal point are, and then all of those sulfur fumes being absorbed into the paper. I mean, as a conservator, that's a big red flag of like,
Well,
wow,
people
I
put
don't
them
think
in a
that's gonna
box. You don't.
understood how the vapors are
Well,
transforming the metal. That's one thing. And in this age of like immediate gratification, we want the silver point to tarnish, and can we have it like now? But
Well,
the
most artists don't.
substrate.
Most artists just let the thing go.
Well, I was going to ask you how ubiquitous that is, or how,
but
in
there
the
are, it's part of what people do and what we know
Sure.
can be done. That is what we were trying to cover. Every
Oh,
possible
no,
variation.
understood. I just in that you're connected to offering advices to artists who may be
Well,
working
all
in
we
this
can do
media.
is tell them what there is, and
It's
I
a-
mean,
it
it's a
would be a
very small
concern.
part of the book that,
Yeah.
Yes.
on this. About writing this book, I planned to write the book for more than 30 years. I began a proposal more than 30 years ago, and I couldn't get a publisher with a then art historian friend that was going to write the book with me. And it was only with the National Gallery show that I thought it's time to try again. And I knew many, many more artists by then. And I proposed to a couple of people the possibility. I pulled out my old proposals, and Tom, who I did not know that well, was super interested. I knew he had done a lot of workshops, and he turned out to be extremely technically oriented, doing research on what was in every metal, and he was perfect co-author for me to do this. So
I have one question for both of you. In the Renaissance, how did artists go about, Leonardo go about making corrections, or maybe he didn't make any, but what have you observed that would be like reworking or change imagine they're working drawings, so there are not that many corrections, but have you observed where there's an effort to remove something?
Only in one or two examples, there's obvious signs of, say, a knife being used to scrape out an ink mark.
And did the knife leave a mark?
Well, it scratched the paper. You could see
But it did leave a
rough. Yeah, no. And this, I'm not talking about a metal point drawing. I haven't seen it on a metal point drawing.
Oh, that's
no.
what I was wondering.
Yeah,
metal
no.
point.
Just
Because
on
it's-
plain paper.
You know, it's obviously it's difficult. And what about in your
Well,
work? Did you
artists-
ever make corrections?
Yes, of course. And it depends on what you're working on, what the ground is, what the surface is. If you're on some kind of gesso ground, you can use sandpaper to sand off. You can use erasers of different kinds. Also a knife to scrape something. But a commercial paper, you'll always know where that was. You won't be able to draw over it. It really varies. It's not a medium that one plunges into that you're going to correct it. And most artists work with the imperfections and the mistakes and the imperfections on the ground. I've known artists who do all kinds of tricks to manipulate these things.
Well, drawings, an artist makes it, they have a change in thought, what the composition is.
Of course.
One of the things we get great pleasure looking at, where he changed his mind, but metal point has so many big rounds, has so many limitations, you just can't do the same thing.
Well, but you can't erase ink very easily either, you
No,
know.
of course not.
And actually, I could sand on all gesso grounds. I can sand something off and hopefully redraw in that area. But I rarely make the corrections. I just usually go with the flow. A more precise figurative artist will work much slower than perhaps I do, and more carefully because they don't want to make mistakes on these things. And the worst case scenario is you tear the work up and start over again.
Anyway, I think on that note, is it a question?
sorry.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear?
Yes,
Is it
yes.
good? Yes, I have a serious question to both of you and to the Met. There are very few examples, I would say. The Doing example that you showed earlier of Silver Point is owned by the Met, and they have some of your work. Why does the Met have so few examples of something that is such a wonderful medium?
God. They don't own my drawings. I wish they did. I hope that at some point one of my drawings enters the collection here. But the print department it's just so interesting here that the print and drawing department, prints go up to contemporary within the print and drawing department, and the drawings stop at, I don't know, the early mid 1900s. If you want to get contemporary, then now we're in another department. And there, the contemporary art department is, I think, buying sculpture and big giant paintings and other kinds of
They're buying
things.
in all areas. I think there have not been that many artists working in metal point, but the interest in materials and how things are made is relatively, I mean, it's always existed, but it's a much broader movement among art historians and curators. It's more recent that they want to have examples of one technique or another. And that's probably accounts for it, and there have not been that many metal points artists who this have been brought to their attention. I think now there's much more awareness of different media, different ways of using things, and I'm sure there's going to be, hopefully there'll be more that are acquired.
Sherry Cammie, who just asked the question, is a metal point artist and teaches metal point in amongst many places at the Art Students League and is in our book.
Yes, I also want, in terms of the book, their materials, the ones that you mentioned are over.
I brought a lot of my tools, and a lot of papers, many of which I'm going to leave to the Met
Which is
Department.
very nice, since we're building a collection of artist materials. We
Not
also
my
got to have,
tools, but I'll leave the paper.
well, whatever, we collect it all. We feel it's
I'm
important.
still using these tools. so.
Anyway, we could go out and have a drink now and continue to ask questions.
And we'll have the lights on so you can take a look at
Yeah.
some examples.
And thank you, both of you. It was so illuminating and enlightening.
I'd love to.